Welcome everyone to the museum's Beneath the Surface talk series. My name is Emily Jadif, and I am the Senior Curator of Maritime Trade and Industry here at the Australian National Maritime Museum. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which the Maritime Museum sits, and the Darug and Gundagura people of the Blue Mountains, which is where I am speaking to you from today. I would like to pay my respects to them, their cultures and elders, past, present, and future, and to any Indigenous peoples who are joining us today. Welcome to the series. And to all of our guests, we have a wonderful program today with Dr. James Hunter. Before I give you his bio and hand you over to him, I will just lay down some of the brief rules of engagement, which are, please do mute yourself. I will be muting myself as soon as I go off. That just helps the experience for everyone. James will talk for a little bit, probably about 35 minutes. And after that, we will have a Q&A session. You are welcome to put your questions in the chat at any time. And you can hold them off until the end of the session. So right now, what I'm going to do.
Hey, I'm not sure if my microphone's working or not. Unfortunately, I can't hear you guys. Are you all good to start?
Yeah, sorry, I already started.
Okay.
I think we're recording.
Sorry for that. This computer is annoying
But
me.
you know what's really interesting?
I'll disappear again.
No, it's okay, because I'm glad you're here, because there are only 3 participants, just us. Megan? We're the only one. Oh, there we go. More people. All right. Well, welcome everyone to the Australian National Maritime Museum's online Beneath the Surface talk series. I really flubbed that one. My name is Emily Jadif. I'm the Senior Curator of Maritime Trade and Industry, and I welcome you to the series and to our speaker today, Dr. James Hunter. We'll tell you a little bit more about James in a moment, but I would first like to acknowledge that the museum is on a Gadigal land, and I am speaking to you today from the Blue Mountains, the traditional lands of the Darug and Gundagura people. And I pay my respects to them, their cultures, past, present, and future, and to all Indigenous peoples who are joining us today. And to all of our guests, a big welcome to the series. Few quick rules of engagement. Just please do remember to mute yourself when you can. James will talk for about 30-35 minutes. It is James, so it might be a little longer than that, but I'll cut him off. He's very interesting. And at the end, we will have a Q&A session. If you have questions that come up to you beforehand, please feel free to put them in the chat and I will collect them and ask them at the end. That's really about it. So I'll just tell you a few brief things about James. Let's see, I have it written down here. It's a long bio. Can I cut it? Okay. James Hunter is the museum's Curator of Naval Heritage and Archaeology. He received his PhD in Maritime Archaeology from Flinders University and MA in History and Historical Archaeology from the University of West Florida. He has been involved in the fields of historical and maritime archaeology for over 2 decades and participated in the investigation of several internationally significant shipwreck sites. These include the American Civil War submarine H.L. Hunley, the Emmanuel Point shipwreck, which is a Spanish galleon wrecked in Pensacola Bay in 1559. James's doctoral research explored the history and archaeology of torpedo boat defenses utilized by the colonial and early navies of Australia and New Zealand. He was appointed to the museum in 2015 and has participated in several maritime archaeology projects here, including the submarine AE-1, the Second World War light cruiser HMAS Perth, and the search for and identification of James Cook's HMB Endeavour. He is currently leading the effort to locate and identify the wreck site of Koning Willem de Tweed. Now, I know James would be happy to chat about any of those shipwreck projects, well, in the chat, so feel free to hit him up while you've got him. And now I would like to welcome James to share his screen. Thank you all so much.
All right, thank you, Emily, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here. And I'm just going to jump back to the beginning here. Stand by. Not quite sure how that happened. Okay, so yeah, a little bit about Koning Willem de Tweed. And for all of those out there who are Dutch, I apologize in advance. My Dutch is terrible, so I'm probably going to butcher any Dutch words that I use in this talk. Just getting that out there right off the bat. So a little bit about this particular vessel, and as a preamble to this, the museum got interested in locating this particular shipwreck because we were approached by the Dutch embassy in Canberra a few years ago about doing a project that would involve funding from what's known as the Shared Cultural Heritage Program that the Netherlands Embassy is in charge of. And basically what they do is they look for shared cultural heritage projects that address shared heritage between Australia and the Netherlands. And they are particularly interested in maritime projects. And so they approached the museum asking what we might be able to do and something that we might be able to obtain funding from them for. And so the idea of Dutch shipwrecks came up. Of course, there are many significant Dutch shipwrecks in Australia. Most of them are very early, and most of them are out on the West Coast. So we thought it'd be fun to do something over here on the other side of the continent that might be a little bit later, sort of looking at a period in history that's not as well addressed. And so that's how we settled upon this project. And the target of our efforts became this vessel, Koning Willem de Tweed, or King William II. A little bit about this vessel. It was built in Kinderdijk in the Netherlands in 1840 in the shipyard of Fop Schmidt, who was a very highly regarded Dutch shipbuilder of that period. It was a big vessel, 800 tons, alternately listed as a frigate or a frigate, built merchant vessel, or a bark ship. And that term, of course, related to its rig. It was a bark. It was first owned by the firm B.J. Soedermont in Rotterdam, and its first captain was L.C. van der Robe. Now, its next owner became the individual who owned the ship for the remainder of its career, and that was Peter Varkvissen. And so he was a very well-known and highly regarded ship owner and influential merchant. He assumed ownership of the vessel in 1842, and he registered it in The Hague, and afterwards transferred that ownership over to Rotterdam. And he owned that vessel until it wrecked in 1857. Now, this is an interesting aspect of this vessel. We don't know much about its career. We know a little bit more now about its early days through archival research conducted by our partners in the Netherlands, but we still don't know very much about its overall sailing history, and that's something that we're really trying to learn more about as we go along. It was a very large ocean-going vessel. We know that it sailed to New York on at least one occasion in 1847, and there is a very good chance that it probably sailed the Atlantic multiple times to multiple ports. But by 1849, Koning Willem was primarily running to Batavia, or what we know as Jakarta in modern-day Indonesia, and it was taking goods from the Netherlands to what was then the Dutch East Indies and bringing goods back. Now, bit of an interesting thing that happened here with its final voyage. We know that it went to Batavia from Amsterdam in 1857. And there is some indication, based on the archival research that's been done, that it made this voyage to Hong Kong to pick up Chinese immigrants. Now, that's always been fairly well known, but there is some suggestion that that voyage may have been unsanctioned. It was a side hustle, if you will, something that its captain decided to do against the orders of the shipping company that he worked for. But we're still looking into that, and that's probably a story that will develop as we go along. What we do know, though, is that Koning Willem departed on its final voyage in June 1857. It was traveling from Hong Kong to Robe in South Australia, carrying around 400 to 412 Chinese passengers, almost all of whom were miners heading for the gold fields in Victoria. It was the 5th Dutch ship that year to transport Chinese migrants to South Australia. And why were they going to South Australia when they ultimately wanted to end up in the Victorian goldfields? Well, the reason for that is because by this point, the Victorian colonial government had imposed a £10 landing fee on each Chinese immigrant that arrived in Melbourne. So to get around this problem, many Chinese began to come to Robe because Robe did not impose that tax or that landing fee. And what they did was they simply debarked at Robe and they made the overland journey to the goldfields, which was hundreds of kilometers. And it was an arduous journey for many of the migrants who took part in it. So on 15 June 1857, Koning Willem arrives at Robe. All of the Chinese passengers were safely disembarked the following day. However, shortly thereafter, the weather started to turn, and the vessel ended up being sequestered in the bay at Robe, which is called Gieschen Bay. That's how you pronounce that funny little word there. And because of that inclement weather, it simply couldn't leave port. So it sat at anchor for another 15 days. And on the 30th of June, a very severe gale struck from the southwest. Now, they couldn't get out of the port, so they deployed more anchors and attempted to try to maintain their position within the bay. And there are various accounts as to what happened there. And there's some indication that they didn't have enough scope out on their anchor chains. But in any event, the weather intensified, the conditions became worse, and worse, and the vessel began to drag anchor. And eventually it got so bad that the windlass holding the anchors was literally torn from the bow of the vessel. At this point, Koning Willem's captain, Hendrik Remmelt Gietzen, decided that he would run the ship aground intentionally in an effort to save his crew. He figured the chances of saving his ship were probably pretty poor by this point, but luckily, or at least in his mind at the time, the eastern end of the bay comprised a large sandy bay. And he thought, that's a perfect sort of bottom for me to ground this vessel in. I can get in, ground the ship, get the boats out, get the crew off, and get them to shore. It was not a rough, rocky coastline that could potentially generate a hazard for the crew. So in his mind, it was the right thing to do. And so that's what he did. And in fact, the vessel did ground on the sand, probably somewhere around 300 to 400 meters off the beach. But unfortunately, the conditions there were so bad and the waves were so high that the vessel began to break up very quickly. And within about 30 minutes, it was drastically coming to pieces. So as this is happening, Gietzen tells his crew to abandon ship. And so they get one of the boats out, it capsizes. They get another boat out. And they managed to get 16 of the 25 crew into this boat. And Gietzen himself was getting ready to step into the boat when the line that was holding it to Koning Willem parted and the boat floated away from the ship. And as it cleared the wrecked vessel and got into the massive swells and waves that were hitting the wreck, it was overturned by one of these waves, and all 16 men in the boat were thrown into the water, and tragically none of them survives. The remainder of the crew did, either through sheer luck in most cases, or there may have been a couple who were able to swim. The story of Gietzen himself is quite remarkable. He was stuck on the stern of the vessel, which was literally coming to pieces all around him, and he was yelling to shore for someone to save him. There are accounts of him doing this. And eventually he got the idea to tie a line around a cask that he'd found on the deck, and he threw it into the water, and it managed to float to shore. And some people on shore grabbed that line, and he tied the other end of it around himself, and they bodily pulled him through the surf. And he barely survived, but he did manage to make it to shore. So a really remarkable story of survival on his part. So in the subsequent years, again, the vessel had started to break up almost at the time it grounded. So within a very short period of time, there wasn't much of it left that was visible above the surface. And over time, it disappeared disappeared from sight and from memory, really. The crew, those who perished tragically, were found over subsequent days. Their bodies were pulled from the water and they were buried up in the dunes close by to where the ship wrecked. So fast forward to the 1990s, and the South Australian Maritime Heritage Office at the time attempted to find the shipwreck site in 1986, 1990, 1991. None of them were successful, unfortunately, although there was quite a lot of effort expended on this. So fast forward again until March 2009, when staff and students from Flinders University, including Ms. Jadif, who just introduced me, you'll see her there in the right-hand side of that image. She oversaw a group of students who attempted to find this same shipwreck in the bay. And unfortunately, they didn't meet with any success either. And I'll explain why as we go along. So that brings us to our project now. So again, we were approached by the Dutch embassy and we applied for funding. We were awarded that funding. And so we began putting together how we might go about doing this project. So the core team is the Australian National Maritime Museum, me and Kieran Hosty, who's the manager for maritime archaeology. But we also have our colleagues at the Silent World Foundation, including Irene Maliaras, Heather Berry, and Paul Hundley. And we are working with Martin Manders from the Cultural Heritage Agency of the Netherlands. He's our project partner based over in Europe. We were also provided generous assistance from the National Trust of South Australia, Robe branch. They are the branch of the National Trust there in Robe. They are a fantastic group, all volunteers, and they have been immensely helpful to us in terms of not only finding historical information for us, showing artifacts that have been given to them by the community, but also they know everybody in the town. So if we need people to tell us what the conditions are like, they were able to put us in touch with people to really help us develop our project and work towards something that would be successful. And we also put out an invite to members of the South Australian Immigrant and Labour Shipwrecks Consortium, which is the same consortium that we have worked with in the past to investigate South Australian, which is another shipwreck up in Victor Harbor. Now, we're kind of lucky in that we had a bit of background here. In 2017, the museum partnered with Silent World Foundation to investigate 3 Dutch shipwreck sites at Ken Reefs, which is out in the Coral Sea territory. And in a turn of good luck, all 3 of those shipwrecks dated to almost the exact same time as Koning Willem. So 1858 was a lost date for those ships. So the year after Koning Willem wrecked in Robe. And they were of similar size, similar build. Now, granted, in most cases, the whole remnants of these ships are gone, but we did have the hardware. We had the anchors, we had fasteners, we had these sorts of things. And so this was good because we had this sort of archaeological material that we could potentially compare with anything we might find in our work in Gieschen Bay. So in April of last year, there was a preliminary walkover survey of Long Beach and a reconnaissance of the area. We basically went in, we talked to the locals about whether they'd seen anything. What are the weather conditions like? Where's the best place to launch a boat? Who owns boats that we might be able to borrow? So we did all of that. We conducted our walk over Long Beach, thinking there could be wreckage material on the beach. We didn't see any at the time, but we certainly were looking for it. And one of the other things that we did is we started to look at artifacts in the National Trust collection that had been provided to them over a course of several years, many of which were supposedly from Koning Willem. And one of the things that we did was 3D photogrammetry. So a good example of probably the best known artifact supposedly from Koning Willem is this cannon, which is sitting on the foreshore of Robe. It's a 4-pounder. It's a pretty big piece of hardware. And I haven't fallen down and can't get up. What I'm doing there is I'm taking photographs of this cannon with a digital camera. And after taking hundreds of photographs, we then took those photographs, put them into a program called Agisoft, and we're able to develop a 3D model. And so what you're looking at here is a screen grab of the 3D model that we were able to render of that cannon. So these artifacts are proving to be quite interesting. This cannon, as an example, is said to have come from Koning Willem. The interesting thing about this gun, though, in doing a little bit of background research on it, is that it is a British cannon. It is not Dutch. It's a British gun, found, made in a British foundry. And there are no markings on it that we can see that indicate it would have had Dutch ownership, but we're still continuing to look into that. What's quite interesting, though, is this unique diagonal pattern that you can see on the gun's breech. Now, the story that's always gone around in the community is that somebody eventually ended up with this gun and decided to use it to crush bone. And so carving the grooves into the gun permitted the bone to stay in place so it could be crushed with some other metallic roller, presumably. I'm not entirely sure I buy that argument. I think the more likely scenario is that those markings were put on there to remove any sort of indication of who produced that gun and who might have owned it. Generally, with guns of this vintage, you find that their foundry mark is on the top of the breech in that very area. And I have seen examples from ships where the ship's name is also put up there. So it's something that we're still pursuing, but it's a very intriguing sort of puzzle that we're playing with there. Some other artifacts that we found. We have what's called a gudgeon. So that's part of the hinge for the rudder of a ship. And on the right, we have a deadeye, a wooden deadeye, which would have been part of the standing rigging. I can tell you that deadeye is very big, and it would have been of the right size for a vessel of Koning Willem's size, being an 800-ton ship. So again, we're looking at these various artifacts, and we're gradually trying to work through them and figure out whether some of them may be associated with the ship. So in November of last year, armed with the reconnaissance information that we were able to acquire, we decided to come back to Robe and continue where we left off. So we had archaeological data, archival information, local knowledge, and we were able to establish a search area where we thought the shipwreck would be located. So you can see that red rectangle on the satellite image. That is showing you where our search area was. We knew that the wreck had occurred approximately 3 to 4 miles north of the town of Robe, up on Long Beach, roughly in the middle of the beach. So one of the first things that we did was to go out to the beach and again do a walkover survey, but this time also employ the use of metal detectors. So that's what we did. So you see a group of us here. In the foreground there is Kevin Jones, who's a former employee of the Maritime Museum here, is also the former director of the South Australian Maritime Museum, and he's been volunteering with us on projects for a number of years now. He recently learned to dive a few years ago, and he's been great. It's great to have people like him in the community who love to come out and just have fun with us. So that's Kevin. I'm just to his right, and then to my right is Heather Berry, who's a conservator with Silent World Foundation, and to her right is Irene Maliaros, also from the Silent World Foundation and a maritime archaeologist. We didn't find anything, unfortunately, metallic, but what we did find proved to be quite intriguing. You'll notice in this image, one thing I want you to note is the number of tire tracks you can see in that photograph. There are no restrictions for people driving on Long Beach, and people frequently drive out on the beach to go camping or to set up picnics. That's great from a recreational standpoint, but not so good from an archaeological standpoint. And it may explain to some degree why we didn't find very much wreckage out there, simply because it's probably been destroyed, run over, compacted beneath a lot of sand. The sand there is very compact and very difficult to dig into. So a very good explanation for that's all the driving. But despite that, we did find a fairly interesting couple of artifacts. And so the image on the left is a fragment of ceramic, seemingly nondescript, not that exciting, you would say, except we had been told by people in the community about bits of pottery they were finding, not only at Long Beach, but elsewhere around Robe. And you'll notice down in the lower right corner there, we have ceramic fragments that are very similar in terms of both the outside glaze and the paste or the clay that the pottery is made of is very similar to what we found on the beach. And it turns out that these ceramics are often from what are called Chinese ginger jars. And that's what's in the top right photo. That's actually a ginger jar that's in the collection of the museum in Robe that was cut off into a bowl. But it's very intriguing that we have two bits of ceramic that are basically definitively Chinese out there on the beach, and you'll see why here shortly. So we did our metal detector survey, and then we got out on the water and we ran what's called a cesium magnetometer. So what this is basically a glorified metal detector. In the lower right-hand corner of the left image, you can kind of see an orange tube. That's called the fish, and that's the sensor. We put that in the water and we tow it behind a boat and we mow the lawn. We basically run transects back and forth in the search area. And that's what we did. And it was pretty quiet magnetically, except in one spot along the beach. And what you see here in this image are a cluster of magnetic hits that we picked up with the magnetometer. Interestingly, they're off the beach. They're roughly the right distance, about 300 to 400 meters off the beach, in the right depth interval, roughly between 3 and 5 meters water depth. And if you look up in the top right of the image, you'll also notice that our Chinese ceramics happen to be very close by on the beach. And what's even more interesting is that those ceramics were found, if you look at the prevailing swell and wind, they're in a straight line running from where we found this cluster of magnetic targets. So very compelling. Unfortunately, as often happens in Robe, the weather turned on us. So while we picked up the targets, we unfortunately couldn't get in the water. To give you an idea, the day that we were out working, running the magnetometer, it was almost like glass, very gentle swell, maybe a meter. Within a day and a half, the swell had kicked up to 4 meters where we had been working. It was absolutely terrifying. We were looking at it from shore. We were not out there running the boat in that, but we were looking at it through binoculars from shore, and it absolutely scared the life out of me. So that gives you a sense of what Robe is like to work in. The conditions can change very quickly and very drastically. And it is really, I think, due to this fact that previous attempts to try to find this shipwreck and others in the bay have been unsuccessful. It's not an easy place to work. And as you'll see, there are other factors too. So we had a magnetic target. We were really pleased about that, but we decided we need to get back out there and we need to, see what's generating these magnetic targets. So in March of this year, we went back. The primary objective, get back to the area where we had found those targets, relocate them, make sure that our magnetometer wasn't acting up and that they were genuine, and then get people in the water and try to figure out what was setting that mag off. We found very large magnetic targets. And so to give you a sense here, this is us mowing the lawn. This time we were in a much larger boat. We used a local cray boat, which was nice. That kind of took the responsibility for having to run the boat off of our shoulders, and we were able to focus on the archaeology. So here's me staring intently at the screen. No, I'm not playing video games, although it might look like I am. And this is an example of one of the magnetic targets that we picked up. So this is the screen. So what you see is a flat line, and as soon as you hit something magnetic, it creates a change in the Earth's magnetic field, and that's registered in this sort of up and down signature that you see on the screen. And we had some very big ones, hundreds of nanotesla. That is the unit of measure that they use. We picked up one that was around 800 nanotesla. To give you an idea of how big that is, shipwreck I worked on in Florida several years ago, the anchor registered 400. So this was twice the size of that. So very big iron object setting this thing off. Once we had picked up these targets, we buoyed them, we went back, we buoyed the largest ones, and then we put some people in the water to have a look and try to determine what we were picking up. So this, again, is going to give you a sense of the conditions we're dealing with in Goshen Bay. It looks very nice on the surface. It's calm. Water looks very kind of tropical. Here's our divers suiting up. And here's our divers in the water. Now, that water has sort of a beautiful kind of green tinge to it. Well, the reason it does is because the sediment there, while a very nice fine sand, as soon as any sort of swell pushes through it, it causes it to raise up into suspension, and it really limits the visibility. So even though we had a very gentle swell the day we were diving, it was causing the water and the sediment on the bottom to just circulate into suspension, and it limited our visibility down to less than a couple meters, quite frankly. So that was challenging. The other issue was that we simply didn't see anything. We ran several searches, very nice, organized, orderly searches of the area, and all we saw was sand. And what that's telling us is that the wreck is almost certainly there, but it's buried completely under the sand, unfortunately. So that makes things a bit challenging for us. And sadly, we managed to get one day of diving in. This is some metal detecting that's happening in this image on the morning of the second day, but by late morning on that day, the conditions turned again, and we started to get significant swell to the extent that our crew simply couldn't work in the water, and so we curtailed diving for the rest of the day. Now, just really quickly, one of the other things that we did while we were in the community, since we couldn't get in the water, we spent the rest of the time, again, talking with National Trust, looking at more artifacts in their collection and trying to determine what they've got. And these are two really good examples. We have a copper fastener on the left, and you can see that it's slightly clenched there at the bottom. So it's been bent over, it's been driven through a timber, and the end kind of bent over so it can't be pulled out. Very indicative of a ship's fastener. And on the right, that sort of weird molten looking gray thing is actually part of a scupper, which is a lead drain, if you will, for the decks. So when water was running through the decks, they find their way through the scuppers, and all the water would go overboard out of the ship and off the deck. So these are very clearly shipwreck artifacts, and we're currently looking at them and trying to figure out where they may have originated as well. So in terms of how we've done on this project, I'd say we've had mixed success. We have found a complex array of magnetic targets that we are very confident is probably the shipwreck of Koning Willem. It's in the right location, it's in the right water depth. The magnetic targets are large, indicating there is something big down there, and sort of the distribution looks right. Taking into account also the Chinese ceramics that are found on shore nearby, that also seems very suggestive of the ship. We didn't find any other magnetic targets within 2 kilometers of this cluster of targets. So it's the only game in town. And the fact that it's in the right place really lends credence to that argument. So we think we've got it, but unfortunately, it's buried and completely buried. So what this means is we're going to have to do more work. We're going to have to get out there and get a bit more aggressive, quite frankly. So what we would like to do is to go back down to Robe, hopefully this year, and conduct more metal detecting, try to finish up our metal detecting survey. And with the metal detectors, hopefully we'll isolate where those magnetic anomalies are, and then we can do a bit of probing. So we'll have probes, we'll run into the seabed and see what we can hit, you know, whether we're hitting metal, timber, that sort of thing. We'll be able to hopefully determine that. And while we're doing that, we'll continue to consult with the National Trust and the community at Robe. They've been incredibly helpful. This is their shipwreck, it's their heritage, and we want to be able to create you know, the sort of environment where they can discuss this and take this information we're finding and present it both to their own community and to anyone who might visit. And to that end, one of the things that we have done as part of the grant is to generate a conservation booklet. We know people have objects, they've turned them over to the National Trust. We've heard that people in the community have things that they're hanging on to. And so we've produced this booklet to help them care for the objects that they have. We don't necessarily want to take anything from anybody, but we do want to give them the information they need so that they can take care of it, so that those artifacts will continue to survive into the future. And that is me. Thank you.
Would like to say thank you so much, James, for your fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed that quite a lot. Now we begin our question and answer time. And I will be looking at the chat here, but you are also welcome to unmute yourself and ask James any questions you like personally. So are there any questions from the field? If not, I'll kick it off. Okay, you ready, James? Let's see, what do I want to know? I'd like to know, say you're probing at the site that you've identified. What would you expect to find? Or what would you hope to find? And what would you expect to find?
Good question. Very good question. I would hope to find the hull. That's what I really would like to find. I'd like to find a section of articulated hull. And the reason for that is because that's the sort of thing we can compare to historical records. You know, we can look at information about how the ship was built and designed, things like scantlings, which are timber sizes, that we can compare to the historical record. And if those two things align very well, that gives us really hard data. Artifacts would be nice. And the thing is, you know, the fact that this ship broke up very quickly and very catastrophically, I suspect we're going to find a lot of the artifacts that are there. I mentioned earlier that there was some indication that the voyage up to Hong Kong was unsanctioned. Well, that's based on the fact there was a court case that occurred in the 1860s, and it was lodged by the first mate of Koning Willem against the captain. And the reason he lodged that court case was because he lost everything in the wreck. He was one of the few survivors, but he lost everything. And that's intriguing. That tells me, ooh, there's lots of stuff down there, potentially on the wreck site. So those are the things I'd hope to find. The things I expect to find, you know, I expect to find what I hope to find. Let's put it that way.
James, you've just gone dark. Are you okay?
No, I'm here. I hit the wrong.
Now, I would like to say that we have a question here from a dear friend of ours in Indonesia. It's from Sinatria. And the question is, I'm doing research on a similar ship type in Bintan Island. If you would, what would you expect to see to identify the ship based on the ship structure? Oh,
cool. Hey, Sinatria. How's it going? Oh, yeah. Well, it's interesting with this particular ship. Our colleagues in the Netherlands are still trying to find specific information about how the ship was constructed. And one of the things that I'm really interested to know is whether there was any iron in this ship's construction. I suspect there was, given its 1850s. I would think that there would be probably iron diagonal braces or knees or frames or that sort of thing. But we don't have any actual historical proof of that. The other thing I know, based on one of the wrecks we looked at Ken Reefs, is that it had iron lower masts, and maybe this one did as well. Again, we've got some big iron targets there, so I'm expecting we're going to see some of that. In terms of timber types, what I have found indicates the vessel was built of European white oak. So, you know, if we did find part of the articulated hull, we definitely want to sample it so we could do some timber species ID. So yeah, I would expect, you'd probably expect to see European species, and probably oak being one of the predominant ones for the actual lower hull. The other thing is that it was copper sheathed and then later resheathed in yellow metal or Muntz metal. So that's the other thing to look at too. If you've got it from 1850s, you're probably going to find yellow metal or Muntz metal for sheathing.
Thank you, James. Excuse me. We have a question now from Jeff. What happened to the Dutch captain in regards to the first mate's lawsuit? What did the owners do about it? It's a good question, Jeff.
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, Geetsen's a funny one. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a postscript to the wrecking event. So wreck occurred, huge loss of life. Geetson sells the wreck to a local carpenter in Robe named Jacob Chambers. And he sells it for about 250 pounds and he disappears, like takes off. Nobody knows what happens to it. And there is some indication that he may have sold that wreck without the ship owner's consent. So long story short, at this point, I don't know what happened to Geetson. I don't know if he stayed in Australia. I don't know if he made it back to the Netherlands. What's interesting about the lawsuit is that Geetson is named as one of the litigants, but the other litigant is the ship owner, Varkvissier. And what's interesting in that court case is that, and this is where we think the voyage, we're pretty sure it was unsanctioned, is that the lawyer for the ship owner said, hey, you can't sue us. This voyage wasn't sanctioned. He was only supposed to go to Jakarta and come back to Amsterdam. So sorry, you can't sue us. So, as for Geetson, I don't know. He could have been getting sued in absentia. So we don't really know, but that's definitely something we're continuing to chase because it's a really interesting story.
Thank you, James. Now, I'm going to, there's a question here about other Dutch shipwrecks in Australia, in particularly in WA. And, I'm expanding on this question. Where are, you've got a Dutch shipwreck in South Australia. We've got the early Dutch wrecks in WA. What other kind of Dutch wrecks are there around Australia? That's a tricky one. Go.
That's a good one. And I can sort of partially answer this one because basically the other reported wrecks that we're aware of, there are some others in Western Australia that are from the mid to late 19th century. I was looking at wrecks from the 1850s because I was interested in finding ones that were contemporary with the ones we had at Ken Reefs. And there, as far as I know, there was only one other one called the Black Swan, which is up on the Barrier Reef. And that one wrecked in, I think, 1857, 1858. So it's the same year. So really, you seem to have that cluster of early Dutch wrecks from the 17th and early 18th centuries. Then you've got another cluster of Dutch wrecks from around the 1850s, which is quite fascinating. And then I think you've got a few more out in WA that date to a little bit later in the 19th century. But those are the only ones I know of. There may be others. But yeah, those are the only ones I'm aware of.
Okay, thank you, James. And now I have a question. How deep under the sand do you think this ship could be? Can you predict from other wrecks that you know of that have been found in similar heavy surf conditions facing open ocean?
Very good question as well. Very good question. It's hard to say. Tricky thing about Geishan Bay and Long Beach is that it's a bit opposite from a lot of places. So whereas other places in South Australia, you're seeing a lot of beach erosion. So the beach is depleting. It's actually, moving further and further back. Geishan Bay is different and Long Beach is different. Long Beach is actually accreting. It's moving out into the water in some places. In other places, it stayed largely the same. But looking at some of that data that's out there, it looks like we have had more sediment deposition. So I mean, our metal detectors only penetrate to anywhere between 80 centimeters and a meter. And that's really going to be, I think, one of the proofs of concept, basically, is we'll get down there. And if we run the metal detectors and we don't pick anything up, that's going to tell us that stuff's buried more than a meter deep. And it could be. I'm hoping that that's not the case and that it's a lot shallower than that. So hard to answer. But I would say probably somewhere between 50 centimeters down to 2 meters or more. We'll just have to see. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, James. We're going to hold you to that. I'll put that in the jar, and whoever counts the correct amount of centimeters it's below gets the prize. All right. Can you tell us a little bit about what other shipwrecks are in and around Robe? And are you interested in looking for those as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Really good question. There are a few around. Within the bay, we've actually got two other shipwrecks from 1857 that were also carrying Chinese immigrants. So we've got Koning Willem, but we also have a ship called the Sultana, which was British. It was carrying Chinese immigrants. And we also have an American-built vessel, although it may have been under British ownership, called the Phaeton. And it too was carrying Chinese immigrants. And in each of these instances, thankfully, all of the passengers and crew survived in both those cases. Both of those shipwrecks are located in the bay. We have some indication of where they might be, having done a little bit of archival work. There's an earlier wreck from 1853 called the Dulius, which is down at the south end of the bay. That's a British ship, roughly around 300 to 400 tons. Those two artifacts that I showed towards the end of the presentation, the scupper fragment and the copper fastener, where those were located down at the south end of the bay is very close to where Dulius historically wrecked. So we think that they may actually be from that shipwreck site. Yeah, so there's that. And then there are a couple others from the latter half of the 19th century. There's the Alma and the Livingston, which wrecked in the 1860s. And then you've got a few others. And they run the gamut from, relatively somewhat large cargo ships down to local, fishing vessels and trading vessels.
Thank you, James. Now, do you think there's any chance that the wreckage could be buried under the sand dunes?
That's entirely possible, and that was sort of a theory that we were operating on. The thing that concerns me, though, again, is, as I noted in that one image, there's a lot of automobile traffic that runs up and down Long Beach, and I do have concerns that if it didn't get far enough up the beach to the dunes, basically, there's a very good chance that stuff's either been run over, or it's been picked up and removed, or it's been run over and buried and basically compacted under a lot of sediment. The only way we would really probably be able to determine that would be to run a magnetometer on the beach. And that's certainly something we could do. It's something we've discussed doing. The metal detectors didn't pick anything up, but again, they only penetrate down to about 80 centimeters. So if there's anything more deeply buried than that, we'd have to get the magnetometer out there to do that work.
That makes sense. And what about the crew? Are their graves known or marked in any way? Those that are buried in the dunes?
Yeah, the ones that were buried in the dunes, their remains were buried together in a mass grave not long after the wrecking event. So within probably the first 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. The location of that grave was known for a number of years, and then it was kind of forgotten. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, some of the bones started to erode out of the dunes. There was a bit of deflation going on with some of the sand dunes where they were buried. So they were actually, exhumed, and they were reburied at another location. And that location, unfortunately, has kind of been lost to memory. But some of the folks at the National Trust there in Robe have a pretty good idea where they think they might be. And they've shared some of that information with us. And one of the things that they've shown us is a map, a property line map. And it's quite interesting because you see this very straight property line running north-south, and then it gets to this one spot, and there's this little sort of indentation that comes out, and then it goes straight again. And it's one of those things where you kind of go, wonder why it would do that. And one of the theories, at least, is that maybe that's where the burial ground was, and they routed the property line around it, because on the one side of the property line was privately owned land, and on the other was Commonwealth owned land, and the burials are in that Commonwealth land. So yeah, that could be where they are, and that would be an interesting thing to try to pursue as well at some point. Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Em.
Well, that must have just looked really exciting. I just wanted, that was my full body way of saying, none of those questions that were asked were mine. Those were all questions from the audience. Fantastic questions, everyone. Now, we do have time for one more question, if anybody has one or not. Yeah, feeling good, feeling great. 4:50. That's I mean, that's a really good time. All right. Well, in that case, I will say thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you very much to James Hunter for your super presentation. The work that the museum does in this area is fantastic, and love the fact that you're working so closely with the community in Robe, and very jealous that you get to go spend time down there, and which is a beautiful area with delicious seafood. So keep enjoying it. Keep doing that there. Now, I would just like to close out this talk by sharing with you one small image in a, there we go. That's what we want it to look like. This series this year is a little bit of a switch up. So some are online and some are in person. So the next talk in the series is in person at the museum. It is on the 7th of June at 11 a.m. It is free because all of these are free. It is a on-site tour called The Plastic Paradox. And this is a joint presentation between the museum's conservation team and the Seabin Foundation, who have the world first 24/7 microplastic analysis lab recovering, treating and analyzing recovered plastics from Sydney Harbor on our waterfront. So it's a really interesting idea because conservation are going to be talking about how they're trying to preserve plastics. As you can see here, the before and after of a swimming cap in the collection, and how it's really tough to get it to stick around. And on the other end of the scale, we have the Seabin Foundation, who are doing their best to remove it and get rid of it. So we hope you will join us. Again, they're free. There are 30 people on the tour, but if it books out, we'll do another one. And then our next online talk after that will be for July with the museum's manager of Indigenous programs, Matt Pohl, which is on sort of decolonizing Aqua Nullius. And that should be a fantastic talk as well. All of our details on our talk are available on the museum's website. They're booking through Eventbrite, and we post all these talks online on our website as well. So you can come back to it if you want to keep reminding yourself about how cool the Koning Willem is. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.